The silence inside the car was shattered by Emma's sharp intake of breath. Outside, three massive German shepherds materialized from the shadows of the supermarket parking lot, their amber eyes locked on the vehicle with unnerving intensity. At 6 years old, Emma Parker knew enough about dogs to understand that these weren't ordinary strays. Their movements were too deliberate, too purposeful. The largest one, with a scar running across its muzzle, placed its paws on the driver's side window, its breath fogging the glass inches from Emma's face. Her tiny hands clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter as the second dog circled to the back, disappearing momentarily from view. The third positioned itself by the passenger door, as if coordinating to surround the car completely. Emma's heart pounded against her ribs as she spotted her stepmother Catherine emerging from the store, grocery bags in hand, still unaware of the situation. Catherine froze mid-step when she saw three powerful German shepherds encircling her car with her stepdaughter trapped inside. When the largest dog turned toward Catherine, its teeth briefly exposed, she dropped the groceries. The sound of shattering glass echoed across the parking lot. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Emma Parker's small world had fractured 2 years ago when her mother's car veered off the mountain road during a sudden snowstorm. At 6 years old, she carried memories of her biological mother like precious stone, smooth, polished moments that she took out and examined in quiet moments, but careful not to lose any detail. Once outgoing and cheerful, Emma had retreated into a world of whispers and watchful silence after the accident. She spoke primarily to Hoppy, the well-worn stuffed rabbit that had been her mother's final gift. Emma possessed an unusual perceptiveness that sometimes unnerved adults. Her hazel eyes seemed to absorb everything, missing nothing. Animals had always gravitated to her, birds landing near her on playground benches, neighborhood cats following her home as if they recognized something kindred in her quiet demeanor. This connection to animals was the only thread of her former self that remained unbroken. Catherine Parker had never planned to be anyone's stepmother. At 34, she had built a life around her career as a veterinary nurse and her beloved collection of tropical fish, the only animals that didn't trigger the debilitating anxiety that had plagued her since a Rottweiler attack left her scarred both physically and emotionally at age 9. The jagged scar on her forearm served as a permanent reminder, though the psychological wounds ran deeper. When she met James Parker at the veterinary clinic where she worked, his daughter Emma had been a complication, not an attraction. Their marriage 11 months ago had been practical, more than passionate, two wounded people recognizing in each other the possibility of companionship, if not healing. Catherine tried to connect with Emma daily, offering gentle questions that were met with one-word answers or silence. The girl's affinity for animals was both a potential bridge between them and a painful reminder of Catherine's limitations. The Parkers lived on a small farm that had been in James's family for generations, though lived on was more accurate than lived off. The 50 acres of rocky Tennessee soil produced little beyond property taxes and maintenance headaches. James worked double shifts in construction to keep them afloat, leaving before dawn and returning after Emma's bedtime most days. The mortgage payments were 60 days behind and the electricity had been shut off twice in the past year. James's pride prevented him from selling the land, while his grief made him emotionally unavailable to both his new wife and his daughter. The three moved through their lives like planets in separate orbits, connected but distant, each carrying private burdens they couldn't bring themselves to share. Catherine approached the car with measured steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. Years of training as a veterinary nurse had taught her to recognize aggressive behavior in animals, but these dogs displayed none of the typical warning signs: no raised hackles, no bared teeth or pinned ears. Instead, they watched her with an almost human intelligence that was somehow more unsettling. "Emma, are you okay?" Catherine called, her voice higher than normal. Emma nodded from behind the glass, her eyes wide but not fearful. "They're not mean," she said when Catherine managed to slip into the driver's seat. "They just want something." The largest shepherd, the one with the scar across its muzzle, placed its paws on Catherine's window again, eyes fixed on her. That's when she noticed a worn leather collar partially hidden beneath thick fur. The other two dogs also wore similar collars, subtle enough to miss at first glance. "I think they might belong to someone," Catherine said, fighting the tremor in her voice. She pulled out her phone and dialed James, who didn't answer, then the local animal control. "They can't send anyone for at least 3 hours," she reported to Emma after hanging up. Emma pressed her small hand against the window where the female shepherd, the smallest of the three, had been watching her intently. "We can't leave him here, Catherine. They'll get hit by a car." The parking lot had begun to fill as the afternoon faded into evening. Several shoppers cast concerned glances toward the vehicle surrounded by large dogs. An elderly man approached, only to retreat when the largest shepherd turned to face him. "Let me check if they have tags," Catherine said, more to herself than to Emma. With reluctance born from both fear and professional obligation, she cracked her door open slowly. The scarred shepherd backed away slightly but didn't flee. Keeping her movements deliberate and calm, Catherine reached for the dog's collar. The shepherd remained still as stone as her fingers found the metal tag attached to the collar. But what caught her attention was something else, a small cylindrical container roughly the size of a prescription bottle secured to the collar with weathered leather straps. It appeared purposefully attached, not accidental. "What is it?" Emma asked, leaning toward Catherine's seat. "I'm not sure." Catherine carefully unscrewed the container, finding inside a tightly rolled piece of waterproof paper and a small photograph protected by plastic. Her hand shook slightly as she unrolled the note, the three dogs watching with uncanny focus. The handwriting was precise but labored, the kind formed by someone for whom writing was physically difficult. "My name is Robert Wells, U.S. Army retired. If you're reading this, I've likely passed away or been forced to leave my home. These dogs, Max, Duke, and Lady, have been my family and my salvation for 8 years. Max, the largest with the scar, was my service dog after my last tour in Vietnam. Duke and Lady were trained as support animals before joining our family. My neighbor Thomas Crawford promised to ensure their safety if anything happened to me. But I've grown suspicious of his intentions. These dogs are highly trained and valuable. They deserve to stay together with someone who will love them as I have. My vehicles have been sold to cover medical debts. They may be seeking familiar scents or appearances. Please help them. My final wish is for them to find peace. You can verify my identity through the Veterans Affairs office in Nashville. God bless you for your kindness." The photograph showed a thin, weathered man in a wheelchair flanked by the three shepherds. Despite his obvious illness, his eyes carried a quiet dignity. The dogs in the picture sat at perfect attention, their posture military precise. "They think we're Robert," Emma whispered, understanding dawning on her face. "Our car looks like his." Catherine glanced around the parking lot, noticing for the first time that their navy blue sedan was one of several similar models. She'd purchased it 3 months ago at a government auction, never questioning its provenance. "We need to verify this," Catherine said, slipping back into professional mode despite the chill that had settled between her shoulder blades. She called the local veterinary clinic where she worked part-time, describing the dogs and asking if anyone had reported them missing. "No reports," Dr. Melissa Warner, her supervisor, confirmed. "But I can run the microchip numbers if you bring them in. Trained service dogs are always chipped." Catherine looked at the three shepherds, then at Emma's pleading face. The girl, who barely spoke 3 sentences together, had already rolled down her window to stroke the female shepherd's head. "Catherine, they're hungry," Emma said with unusual authority. "I can feel their ribs." A quick call to the Veterans Affairs office in Nashville yielded confirmation that Robert Wells existed, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran with a distinguished service record. However, the clerk couldn't disclose his current status or location due to privacy regulations. "I need to make a few more calls," Catherine told Emma, dialing James again. This time he answered, his voice tinny over the construction site background noise. 3 German shepherds. "Catherine, you know we can't afford dog food for one animal, let alone 3, he said, exhaustion evident in every word. And what about your, or phobia? He couldn't even name it directly anymore. I know, but Catherine paused, watching Emma interact with Lady through the cracked window. The girl was smiling, actually smiling for the first time in months. There's a note. They belong to a veteran. James, they're service dogs. So take them to the shelter, they'll find homes. The note specifically asks to keep them together. And you know what happens to older dogs at the county shelter. Catherine could almost hear James running his hand through his hair, his typical gesture when stressed. Just for tonight, he finally said, "We'll figure something out tomorrow." After ending the call, Catherine turned to Emma. "We're taking them home, but just temporarily. Tomorrow we'll find out more about Robert Wells and figure out what to do." Emma's face brightened with the first genuine smile Catherine had seen since their wedding day. "They can sleep in my room." "No, they'll stay in the barn," Catherine said firmly, fighting against the tide of anxiety rising in her chest at the thought of 3 large dogs in her house. "Just until we find them a proper home." As Catherine cautiously opened her door wider, the 3 shepherds backed away, giving her space. Max, the scarred leader, watched her with unnerving intelligence as she retrieved a length of rope from her trunk. Her disciplined behavior, as she fashioned makeshift leashes, confirmed everything the note had said. These were no ordinary strays. They were military-trained service animals, possibly worth thousands of dollars and somehow connected to their second-hand car. What Catherine couldn't possibly know as she loaded 3 German shepherds into the back of her sedan was that this moment would alter the trajectory of their lives forever. The mystery of Robert Wells and his highly trained dogs was just beginning to unfold. The Parker farmhouse stood silhouetted against the deepening twilight as Catherine's sedan crawled up the gravel driveway. The 3 German shepherds sat with military precision in the back, their breathing the only sound apart from the crunch of tires on stone. Emma twisted in her seat to watch them, her small face animated in a way Catherine hadn't seen since before the wedding. James Parker waited on the porch, his tall frame tense with exhaustion and weariness. At 38, he looked closer to 50, the past 2 years having etched permanent lines around his eyes and mouth. His construction-weathered hands gripped the porch railing as the car came to a stop. "They're here, Daddy," Emma called out, unbuckling her seatbelt before Catherine could stop her. The girl flung open her door and scrambled toward her father, more energetic than she'd been in months. James's eyes widened as he took in the 3 imposing German shepherds watching him through the car windows. "Catherine," he began, his voice strained, "what were you thinking?" Catherine removed her keys with deliberate slowness, organizing her thoughts before facing her husband. "I was thinking that 3 trained service animals deserve better than being abandoned in a parking lot," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the anxiety fluttering in her chest at the prospect of releasing 3 large dogs on their property. "We can't afford this," James said, pulling Emma protectively closer as Catherine opened the back door. The dogs remained seated, awaiting command, a testament to their training. "The property taxes are due next month, and the Northfield fence needs replacing before winter. Dog food for 3 animals this size would cost more than our grocery budget." Catherine nodded, acknowledging his concerns while carefully attaching the makeshift leashes to each dog's collar. "It's temporary, James. Just until we find out what happened to their owner and locate a suitable home." She handed Emma the leash connected to Lady, the smallest shepherd. "One night won't bankrupt us." "And where exactly are they sleeping?" James asked, eyeing the dogs with a mixture of concern and resignation. "The barn," Catherine answered firmly. "I've set up the old horse stalls with blankets." Emma's face fell. "But they'll be cold out there." "They have thick fur, sweetheart," Catherine explained gently. "And they'll have each other for warmth." The ensuing dinner was characterized by uncomfortable silence, punctuated by Emma's uncharacteristic chattiness about the dogs. James picked at his reheated casserole, his expression darkening with each enthusiastic observation from his daughter. "Max protected soldiers in Vietnam, Daddy. Just like Grandpa John did, Emma said, referring to James's father, who had served 2 tours before returning home with injuries that eventually claimed his life. And Lady can sense when people are sad. She kept putting her head on my lap in the car, right where it hurts most, when I think about Mommy. James set his fork down with enough force to make the plates jump. Emma, these dogs are not staying. They're not ours. We can't afford pets right now, especially not 3 large ones with special training. Emma's lower lip trembled. But they chose us, Daddy. Their owner said. Their owner is dead, James interrupted, then immediately softened his tone at Catherine's sharp look. I'm sorry, Em, I know you've made a connection, but sometimes life doesn't work out the way we want. These dogs need a home that can properly care for them. Catherine watched the familiar shutters close behind Emma's eyes, the brief glimpse of the vibrant child she had once been disappearing behind the wall of grief she'd constructed. The progress of a single afternoon vanished in an instant. May I be excused? Emma asked in the small, polite voice that had become her standard mode of communication. After Emma left the table, Catherine faced her husband. James, I know our finances are tight, but you saw her today. She was engaged, animated, she was present in a way she hasn't been since Sarah died. James ran his hands through his thinning hair. We can't make major life decisions based on temporary reactions, Catherine. You of all people should understand. What about your fear? How are you planning to live with 3 large dogs when you can barely handle being in the same room as Mrs. Peterson's Chihuahua at the clinic? Catherine flinched, the memory of panic attacks after her childhood dog attack still vivid. I'm managing, she said, though the afternoon had left her drained from the constant vigilance of keeping her fear in check. And my condition shouldn't dictate whether Emma gets the support she needs. So I'm the bad guy for being practical. James pushed his plate away. Those dogs eat more in a week than our grocery budget for a month. Veterinary care for 3 animals, training, maintenance. And what about the fact that they're probably worth thousands as service animals? What if this Robert person's family comes looking for them? Catherine hesitated, then shared her most significant discovery from the afternoon's phone calls. The car, she said quietly. Our car might be connected to these dogs. James's forehead creased. What are you talking about? I bought the sedan at the government auction in Nashville 3 months ago. According to Robert's note, his vehicles were sold to cover medical debts. The dogs recognized the car, James. They thought we were him coming back for them. The color drained from James's face. You're saying we're driving a dead man's car? Or that these dogs tracked us down because of it? I'm saying there might be a reason they found us specifically. Catherine reached for his hand across the table. Maybe it's coincidence, maybe it's something more. But doesn't it make you wonder why they showed up today at that specific moment with Emma alone in the car? James withdrew his hand. Don't turn this into some sort of divine intervention, Catherine. We're struggling to keep the farm, to keep food on the table. I'm working 14-hour days 6 days a week. Adding 3 large dogs to our responsibilities is irresponsible, no matter how attached Emma's become. Their argument was interrupted by a soft thud from the direction of Emma's bedroom, followed by the distinct sound of a window sliding open. Catherine and James exchanged alarmed glances before racing down the hallway. Emma's room was empty, her bedside lamp illuminating the open window and the small footprints in the flower bed below. James cursed under his breath as they hurried toward the barn, the full moon providing enough light to see Emma's small figure slipping through the barn door. They found her curled up on a pile of hay between Max and Duke, with Lady's head resting in her lap. The 3 shepherds looked up as the adults entered but made no move to leave their positions. Emma, James began, his voice tight with anger and fear. They were crying, Emma interrupted, her voice small but determined. They miss him. They're scared. Lady says they've been alone for days. Dogs don't talk, sweetheart, Catherine said gently, though her professional experience made her wonder at the level of communication possible between a sensitive child and emotionally intelligent animals. Not with words, Emma insisted. But they tell me things. Max is hurting here. She pointed to her own side where a patch of fur on the large shepherd appeared matted. And Duke doesn't eat much because his stomach hurts. Lady is the youngest, but she takes care of the boys. Catherine approached cautiously and knelt to examine Max. The shepherd remained still as she parted his fur to reveal a healing wound along his ribcage. This needs cleaning, she murmured, her veterinary training temporarily overriding her fear. James watched the scene with conflicting emotions visible on his face: concern for his daughter, worry about their finances, and something else, but something that looked almost like longing as he observed Emma animated and engaged. But 1 week, he finally said, his voice rough. We'll keep them for 1 week while we locate Robert's family or find a suitable home. But Emma, you have to promise not to get too attached. These dogs have special training and probably belong somewhere specific. Emma nodded solemnly, but the hope blazing in her eyes told a different story. Catherine recognized it immediately, the same desperate hope she'd harbored when she married James, but the belief that broken pieces could somehow fit together to create something whole. As they walked back to the house, Emma between them holding both their hands, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had irrevocably changed course. The mystery of the 3 German shepherds and their connection to the Parker family's second-hand car was only beginning to unfold. But one thing was already clear: the careful distance the 3 humans had maintained from each other had been irreparably breached by the arrival of 3 unexpected animals. The first morning with 3 German shepherds on the Parker farm brought challenges Catherine hadn't anticipated. She woke before dawn, her sleep fragmented by anxiety dreams where massive dogs cornered her in progressively smaller spaces. Determined to maintain control of the situation, she dressed quickly and headed to the barn before Emma or James stirred. The cool morning air carried the scent of approaching autumn as Catherine approached the barn, medical kit in hand. Her steps slowed as she reached the door, her heartbeat accelerating. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open, bracing herself for 3 large dogs rushing toward her. Instead, she found them in precisely the same positions they'd occupied the night before. Max, the scarred leader, sat at attention near the door, his amber eyes tracking her movement. Duke remained in his stall, head resting on paws but fully alert. Lady stood and stretched but maintained her distance, as if sensing Catherine's discomfort. "Good morning," Catherine said awkwardly, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet barn. She set down the medical kit and removed gauze, antiseptic, and antibacterial ointment. "Max, I need to check your side." To her surprise, the large shepherd approached and positioned himself beside her, exposing the injured area without prompting. The precision of his movement confirmed what the note had indicated: these were extensively trained animals worth thousands of dollars and years of specialized instruction. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she cleaned the wound, but Max remained perfectly still. "You're a good boy," she whispered, the praise feeling foreign on her lips. It had been 25 years since she'd touched a dog willingly, the phantom sting of childhood stitches flaring on her forearm. "He likes you." Emma's voice came from the doorway, startling Catherine. "I thought you were still asleep," Catherine said, finishing the bandage on Max's side. Emma approached slowly, her nightgown brushing the hay-strewn floor. "Lady told me you were here." At Catherine's skeptical expression, she added, "I heard her get up and look toward the door. Dogs hear things we don't." Over the next 3 days, Catherine found herself gradually adjusting to the presence of the shepherds. Professional detachment helped. She monitored their health, measured appropriate food portions from the bags James reluctantly purchased, and established feeding schedules. She maintained physical distance when possible, but each successful interaction diminished her anxiety incrementally. The dogs, for their part, seemed to understand her limitations. They never approached without invitation, maintained respectful distance, and responded to even her hesitant commands with immediate compliance. Max in particular seemed to have appointed himself her guardian, depositioning himself between Catherine and any perceived threat, including the aggressive rooster that had terrorized her since they moved to the farm. Gaines remained resolute about the temporary nature of their arrangement, but even he found his resistance weakening. On the fourth morning, Catherine discovered him in the barn before his shift, replacing the worn leather collars with new ones he'd purchased on his lunch break the previous day. The old ones were chafing, he explained gruffly when he noticed her watching. Just trying to be humane until we find them a permanent home. Catherine nodded, not mentioning the dog training manual she'd spotted in his truck, or the way he'd begun saving scraps from his dinner for Duke, whose appetite remained concerning. The most dramatic transformation, however, was in Emma. The withdrawn, silent child who had moved through the house like a ghost for months had been replaced by a vibrant, chattering presence. She spent every available moment with the dogs, reading to them from her school books, teaching them the names of her stuffed animals, and confiding secrets that Catherine and James had been unable to access. "Lady says she misses her person," Emma reported over breakfast on the fifth day. "But she thinks we're her people now, too. Max is still waiting for Robert to come back, though." Catherine and James exchanged glances. They'd made calls to every veterans organization in the state, placed notices online, and even contacted the Nashville VA directly. The consistent response was both frustrating and concerning. Robert Wells had been a resident at the VA nursing home until approximately 3 weeks ago, when he was transferred to an unspecified hospice facility, where privacy regulations prevented them from learning more without legal standing. "Emma, remember what we discussed," James said gently. "The dogs might not be able to stay with us permanently." Emma nodded, though her expression remained stubborn. "I know, but they need us right now. Duke still isn't eating properly." Catherine had noticed this as well. While Max and Lady consumed their food with healthy appetites, Duke picked at his meals and occasionally whimpered when lying down. Her professional experience suggested something more serious than simple adjustment issues. "I think we should have Dr. Warner examine him," Catherine suggested. "I can bring him to the clinic tomorrow during my shift." The following day revealed the complexity of their situation. Dr. Warner's examination of Duke identified a mass in his abdomen that required surgical intervention, a procedure that would cost approximately $3,000. "He's otherwise healthy and could have years ahead of him with proper treatment," Dr. Warner explained as Duke lay sedated after the ultrasound. "But without surgery, the prognosis isn't good. 3 months, maybe less." Catherine's throat tightened. "We're just fostering temporarily. I don't know if we can make that decision." Dr. Warner's expression softened with understanding. "The practice has a fund for cases like this, not enough to cover everything, but it could help. These dogs saved their owner's life, Catherine. That counts for something in my book." When Catherine returned home with Duke and the devastating news, she found James and Emma sitting at the kitchen table with a visitor, Officer Daniel Reynolds from the County Sheriff's Department. "Mrs. Parker," the officer greeted her, "I understand you found 3 German Shepherds recently." Catherine's arms instinctively tightened around Duke's carrier. "Yes, about a week ago. We've been trying to locate information about their owner." Officer Reynolds nodded. "That's why I'm here. We received a report about 3 dogs matching their description. A man named Thomas Crawford claims they belong to his uncle, Robert Wells, who passed away recently. He's provided documentation showing he's the next of kin." James frowned. The note we found specifically mentioned concerns about this neighbor Crawford. Said he didn't trust the man's intentions regarding the dogs. "Unfortunately, family disputes about inheritance aren't uncommon," Officer Reynolds replied. "Without evidence of wrongdoing, the legal next of kin has rights to the deceased property, including animals." Emma's face had drained of color. "But Duke is sick," she whispered. "He needs surgery. This Crawford person won't pay for that. He'll let Duke die." The officer's expression softened as he knelt to Emma's level. "I understand you become attached to these animals, young lady. But the law has specific provisions about found property and inheritance. They're not property, Emma said fiercely. They're heroes. Robert's note said Max saved soldiers' lives. They deserve better than someone who just wants to sell them. Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Sell them? Catherine explained about the dog's specialized training in potential value. Service dogs with their level of training can be worth $25,000 each, possibly more with their military background. We're concerned Mr. Crawford's interest is financial rather than sentimental. The officer made notes in his small notebook. I'll look into it. In the meantime, you're authorized to continue caring for the animals, especially if one requires medical attention. Mr. Crawford has agreed to give us time to investigate his claim properly. He hesitated, then added more gently, but I should warn you, if his documentation is legitimate, you may have to surrender the dogs within the week. After the officer left, Emma fled to her room in tears. James sank into a kitchen chair, his expression troubled. $3,000 for surgery, he muttered. We can barely make the mortgage as it is. Catherine set Duke's carrier down carefully. There's something else, she said quietly. Dr. Warner found a microchip in Duke, standard procedure for scanning strays. She took a deep breath. The registered owner isn't Robert Wells. It's the U.S. Army Working Dog Program, specifically the 75th Ranger Regiment. James's head snapped up. Rangers? My father served with the 75th. There's more, Catherine continued. The chip contained contact information for a handler named Lieutenant Robert Wells, but also listed a secondary contact, Captain John Parker. James stared at her, the color draining from his face. My father? The dates align with his service period. Dr. Warner is making inquiries through official channels, but it appears these dogs, or at least Duke, may have a connection to your father's military service. The revelation spread through their small community with surprising speed. By the following afternoon, Catherine's phone buzzed constantly with messages from neighbors offering support. Mrs. Abernathy from the church brought a homemade casserole and a check for $50 toward Duke's surgery. Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner, dropped off premium dog food and mentioned that his son-in-law worked for the Veterans Administration and might be able to help navigate the bureaucracy. The most unexpected support came from Catherine's clients at the veterinary clinic. Dr. Warner had apparently shared the story with Catherine's permission, and by the end of her shift, a mason jar labeled Duke's Surgery Fund contained nearly $400 in cash and several promises of more to come. People respect military service, Dr. Warner explained as they counted the day's donations. And they love a good mystery. The connection between these dogs, your car, and your father-in-law's military services captured everyone's imagination. The community's response brought mixed emotions for Catherine. The financial support was deeply appreciated, but the attention made their temporary arrangement feel increasingly permanent. James had stopped talking about finding the dogs another home, instead spending his evenings researching the 75th Ranger Regiment's K-9 history. But Emma had begun introducing herself to neighbors as the girl with 3 hero dogs, her previously withdrawn personality blossoming with each retelling of their story. Yeah. Catherine's own transformation proved most surprising of all. The woman who had once declined dinner invitations to avoid homes with pets now found herself sleeping with her bedroom door open, and listening for any sounds of distress from Duke, as he recovered from his preliminary treatments. Lady had taken to lying outside her bedroom door at night, a silent guardian, Catherine, more comforting than alarming. You're different with them, James observed on the 10th evening as they sat on the porch watching Emma play fetch with Max in the twilight. More confident. Catherine nodded, surprising herself with the realization. They're predictable. Unlike most dogs, they don't jump or make sudden movements. They respect boundaries, she smiled faintly. And they protected Emma when she needed it most. That counts for a lot. Do you think we should fight for them? James asked, the question he'd been avoiding for days finally surfacing. If this Crawford person pushes his claim. Before Catherine could answer, the phone rang. The caller ID displayed the Nashville Veterans Affairs Medical Center. James answered, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as he listened. "We'll be there tomorrow morning," he said, finally ending the call with trembling hands. "What is it?" Catherine asked, concern tightening her chest. James looked at her, then at Emma and the dogs in the yard. "Robert Wells isn't dead," he said quietly. "He's been in hospice care for terminal cancer, but he's very much alive. And he's asking to see his dogs and us before he passes." Catherine felt the world shift beneath her, all their assumptions about the situation suddenly cast into doubt. If Robert Wells was alive, Thomas Crawford's claim as next of kin was fraudulent. But it also meant the dogs still had an owner who loved them, who might want them back for whatever time he had left. The realization brought an unexpected ache to Catherine's chest. In less than 2 weeks, 3 German shepherds had transformed from frightening intruders to essential parts of their fragile family. The prospect of saying goodbye, even to return them to their rightful owner, felt like losing something precious just as she'd found the courage to embrace it. The next morning dawned with a heavy mist clinging to the Tennessee hills, shrouding the Parker farm in ghostly white. Catherine rose before the alarm, her sleep having been fitful and shallow. The prospect of meeting Robert Wells, a man they had believed dead, whose dogs had inexplicably transformed their family dynamic, filled her with conflicting emotions. Duke's condition had deteriorated overnight. His breathing had become labored, and he'd refused even the special chicken broth Catherine had prepared. The urgency of his medical situation added another layer of tension to their impending visit to the hospice facility. "He's not going to make it much longer without intervention," Catherine told James as they loaded the 3 shepherds into the back of their sedan. Emma sat silently in the back seat, her small face solemn as she stroked Lady's head. "Dr. Warner says the mass is likely pressing against his diaphragm now. That's why his breathing is compromised." James nodded grimly, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Did you bring the folder with all the documentation? The note, the VA paperwork, everything about the connection to my father?" Catherine patted her messenger bag. "It's all here, along with Duke's medical records and the estimate for surgery." The Magnolia Gardens Hospice Center stood on the outskirts of Nashville, its brick exterior partially obscured by the towering magnolia trees that gave the facility its name. A sympathetic nurse met them in the parking lot, having been briefed about the unusual circumstances of their visit. "Mr. Wells has good days and difficult ones," she explained, leading them toward a private entrance. "The day is somewhere in between. The excitement about seeing his dogs has given him energy, but please understand his condition is advanced. He tires easily." The nurse hesitated, looking at Duke and his carrier. "We don't typically allow multiple animals, but given the circumstances an exception has been made. However, if the staff feels Mr. Wells is becoming too agitated or exhausted, we may need to cut the visit short." They followed her through quiet corridors to a small garden courtyard accessible from Robert's room. "We thought this might be better than bringing 3 large dogs inside," she explained. "Mr. Wells can be wheeled out when you're ready." Catherine knelt beside the carrier containing Duke. The shepherd's eyes were dull with pain, his breathing shallow. "James, I'm worried about Duke. This level of stress isn't good for him and his condition." James nodded, concern etching lines around his eyes. "Let's see how it goes. Maybe seeing Robert will actually help him." Emma stood between Max and Lady, holding their leashes with a composure that belied her 6 years. "They know he's here," she said quietly. "They can smell him." As if confirming her words, all 3 dogs turned simultaneously toward the French doors leading from the building to the courtyard. A moment later they opened to reveal a nurse wheeling a gaunt man with silver hair. Despite his evident frailty, Robert Wells carried himself with military bearing, his thin shoulders squared and his spine straight against the wheelchair's support. The reaction from the dogs was immediate and heart-wrenching. Max let out a soft whine, his entire body trembling with restraint. Lady pulled gently against her leash, her tail wagging hesitantly as if unsure whether to believe her senses. In his carrier, Duke struggled to rise, his pain momentarily forgotten. "My boys," Robert's voice cracked as he extended a trembling hand. "And my lady girl, you found them." Catherine released Max from his leash, trusting the dog's training. The shepherd approached Robert with dignified restraint, pressing his muzzle into the elderly man's palm. Lady followed, her entire body wiggling with barely contained joy. Catherine opened Duke's carrier last, helping the weakened dog navigate the short distance to his master. Robert's weathered face crumpled as Duke limped toward him. "What's happened to my boy?" "He has a mass in his abdomen," Catherine explained gently, her professional manner helping her maintain composure in the emotionally charged moment. "It requires surgical intervention, but the prognosis could be good with proper treatment." Robert nodded, his hand gently exploring Duke's side. He was always the delicate one. Brilliant mind, but physically vulnerable. His faded blue eyes lifted to Catherine's face. "You're a veterinarian?" "Veterinary nurse," she corrected. "I've been caring for them since they found us." "Found you?" Robert's eyebrows lifted. "I was told they were being held as strays." James stepped forward, introducing himself and Emma. "They surrounded our car in a supermarket parking lot about 2 weeks ago. They wouldn't leave. We found your note in the container on Max's collar." Recognition dawned on Robert's face. "The blue sedan. Thomas said he'd sold my car to a young family." His gaze sharpened. "You have my car." "We bought it at a government auction 3 months ago," Catherine confirmed. "We had no idea of its history until the dogs found us." Robert smiled faintly, scratching behind Max's ears. These boys were trained to recognize and remember up to 50 different vehicles. Part of their military function was target identification. He gazed down at the 3 dogs surrounding his wheelchair. "They must have recognized the car and thought I'd come back for them." Emma, who had been unusually quiet, stepped forward. "Your note said you were suspicious of Mr. Crawford. He told the police you were dead and tried to take the dogs back." Robert's expression hardened. "Thomas was my neighbor for 7 years. When my health declined, he offered to handle my affairs, selling the car to cover medical bills, maintaining my house until it could be sold, and most importantly, finding proper homes for my dogs." His hand trembled slightly as he stroked Lady's head. "I began to suspect his intentions weren't honorable when he started asking detailed questions about their training and value." "The police officer mentioned Crawford provided documentation showing he's your next of kin," James said. "Impossible. I have no living relatives," Robert replied sharply. "My sister passed 3 years ago. Thomas has no legal claim to anything of mine, especially not my dogs." The conversation was interrupted by Duke's sudden collapse, his legs giving out as a spasm of pain racked his body. Catherine rushed forward, her medical training overriding everything else. "He needs emergency care," she said, checking his gums and finding them pale. "The mass may have ruptured." Robert's face contorted with grief. "I can't lose him. Not now. Not when I've found them again." James knelt beside the elderly veteran. "Sir, the surgery costs approximately $3,000. The community has raised almost $800, and we're prepared to cover some expenses, but—" "Money is not an issue," Robert interrupted. "I have savings. Thomas was never given access to my accounts, only power to sell specific assets." He turned to the nurse hovering nearby. "Angela, in my room there's a leather portfolio in the top drawer. Bring it immediately." While they waited, Catherine and James worked together to stabilize Duke, making him as comfortable as possible. Emma sat beside Robert's wheelchair, Lady's head in her lap. "Your daughter has a gift," Robert observed quietly to James. "Military K-9 units would recruit her in a heartbeat. Yet, she understands them." James glanced at Emma, her small hand confidently checking Lady's ears the way Catherine had taught her. "She lost her mother 2 years ago. Hasn't connected with anyone or anything since until your dogs found us. Robert nodded thoughtfully. Dogs know. Especially these three. They were trained to identify people in distress. He smiled faintly at Emma. They probably recognized a kindred spirit. The nurse returned with Robert's portfolio. With trembling hands he extracted several documents, including a bank book showing a substantial balance in legal papers Catherine couldn't identify from a distance. This account was established specifically for their care, Robert explained. I never gave Thomas access to it. I need you to take Duke for his surgery immediately. Use whatever funds necessary. He hesitated, then pulled out another document. And I'd like you to consider this. Catherine accepted the paper, scanning it quickly before gasping. This is a transfer of ownership. Robert nodded, his expression solemn. I have weeks left, possibly days. These dogs deserve a family who understands their value beyond their training or pedigree. His gaze moved from Catherine to James to Emma. They chose you. That matters to me. Emma looked up, her eyes wide. You want us to keep them? Forever. If your parents are willing, Robert replied gently. I've watched how they respond to you all. Max has positioned himself protectively near your mother despite her obvious initial discomfort with dogs. Lady hasn't left your side, and Duke trusts your father enough to show vulnerability. He smiled faintly. They're excellent judges of character. Better than I was regarding Thomas. James looked stunned. Sir, we're honored, but these are highly trained military animals worth. Their family, Robert interrupted firmly. Not assets. And family belongs together. He gestured toward the paperwork. Everything is in order. My attorney visited yesterday to finalize arrangements. All I need is your signature and your promise that they'll stay together. Catherine exchanged a glance with James, the magnitude of the decision weighing heavily between them. Taking permanent responsibility for 3 German shepherds would transform their lives completely financially, logistically, emotionally. Yet the prospect of surrendering them now seemed equally impossible. Before either could respond, Duke let out a distressed whine, his condition clearly deteriorating. Robert reached for Catherine's hand. Go, take him now. The rest can wait until you return. Just promise me you'll save him if you can. James scooped Duke into his arms while Catherine gathered the paperwork. We'll call as soon as we know anything, she promised, her veterinary training taking precedence over everything else. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of emergency veterinary procedures, tense phone calls, and difficult decisions. Dr. Warner, upon examining Duke, confirmed that the mass had indeed ruptured, necessitating immediate surgery. The procedure would be complex and risky, with no guarantee of success. Without surgery, he won't survive the night, Dr. Warner explained gently. With it, he has perhaps a 60% chance of recovery. Catherine called the hospice center, where a nurse held the phone to Robert's ear. Do everything possible, the elderly veteran instructed, his voice weak but resolute. He survived worse, he's a fighter. The surgery began just after noon, with Catherine assisting Dr. Warner in the operating room. James and Emma waited in the clinic's small reception area, Max and Lady lying at their feet with unusual stillness, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. Midway through the procedure, the clinic's front door burst open, revealing Officer Reynolds and another police officer escorting a handcuffed Thomas Crawford. Where are they? Crawford demanded, his face flushed with anger. Those dogs are legally mine. I have paperwork proving inheritance rights. Officer Reynolds maintained a firm grip on Crawford's arm. Mr. Parker, I apologize for the intrusion. We've discovered Mr. Crawford attempting to access Robert Wells' bank accounts with falsified documents. When we questioned him, he admitted to similar falsification regarding inheritance of the dogs. James stood, positioning himself between the officers and Emma. Robert Wells is alive. We've just come from visiting him at Magnolia Gardens Hospice. Crawford's face drained of color. That's impossible. He was transferred to end-of-life care. The facility told me he had days, maybe hours. And yet he's still with us, Officer Reynolds remarked dryly. Apparently too stubborn to die before ensuring his dog's welfare. He glanced around the clinic. Speaking of which, where is the third dog? In surgery, James replied, his voice tight with emotion. Fighting for his life because you abandoned them in a parking lot instead of finding them proper homes as Robert requested. Crawford's expression hardened. Do you have any idea what those dogs are worth? Fully trained military service animals with distinguished records. I could have sold them for enough to retire. And that's exactly why Robert never intended for you to have them, James said coldly. They're not commodities, they're heroes. Officer Reynolds nodded to his partner. Take him to the car. To James he added, we'll need statements from all of you, but it can wait until your dog is out of surgery. After they departed, James called the hospice center again, this time with news of Crawford's arrest. The nurse who answered sounded strangely hesitant. Mr. Parker, I'm afraid Mr. Wells has taken a turn for the worse, she said gently. The excitement of this morning, combined with his condition, the doctor doesn't expect him to regain consciousness. James closed his eyes, the cruel timing almost too much to bear. Can you put the phone to his ear anyway? There's something he needs to hear. The nurse agreed, and James knelt beside Emma. Your mother just sent a message from the operating room, he said quietly. Duke is going to make it. The surgery is nearly complete, and Dr. Warner is confident about his recovery. He held the phone where Max and Lady could hear as Emma repeated the news, her voice clear and strong. Duke is safe, Mr. Robert. He's going to be okay. And we promise to keep all three of them together forever. Whether Robert Wells heard those words before passing peacefully 20 minutes later, no one could say with certainty. But the hospice nurse who witnessed his final moments reported that his expression softened into what appeared to be a smile just before he slipped away. Duke survived the surgery, though his recovery would require weeks of careful monitoring and rehabilitation. As evening settled over the clinic, Catherine finally emerged from the treatment area, exhausted but triumphant. He's stabilized, she announced to James and Emma. Dr. Warner is confident the entire mass was removed successfully. She knelt to address Max and Lady directly, no longer hesitant to make eye contact with the Shepherds. Your brother is going to be okay. The relief in the small waiting room was palpable, quickly tempered by James's gentle delivery of the news about Robert. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she absorbed the bittersweet reality they had saved Duke, but too late for Robert to see his beloved companion again. He knew, Emma said with the simple certainty of a child. Lady says he knew Duke would be okay. That's why he could go. Catherine and James exchanged glances over their daughter's head, neither willing to dismiss her conviction. The events of the past 2 weeks had stretched the boundaries of coincidence far enough to make even the skeptical veterinary nurse wonder if something more profound might be at deeper work. As they prepared to take Max and Lady home, with Duke remaining at the clinic overnight, Dr. Warner approached with the paperwork Robert had provided. The transfer of ownership documents are in order, she confirmed. And there's something else you should see. She handed Catherine a sealed envelope with "For Duke's New Family" written in shaky handwriting across the front. Inside was a check for $15,000 and a handwritten note, for Duke's care and to help ease the transition. The remaining funds in the account will transfer automatically upon my passing. My dogs chose wisely. Thank you for completing our mission. Robert Wells, Captain, U.S. Army, Ret. The financial burden that had weighed so heavily on the Parkers' decision suddenly lifted, but the emotional weight of responsibility settled more firmly in its place. They were now the legal guardians of 3 extraordinary animals with complex needs and remarkable abilities. What do we do now? James asked softly, the events of the day having left them all drained and vulnerable. Catherine looked at Emma, who had fallen asleep between Max and Lady on the clinic's waiting room bench, and then at James, whose face reflected the same tumultuous mix of grief, at relief and uncertainty that churned within her. "We go home," she said simply, "all of us together. And we figure out the rest tomorrow." Robert Wells' funeral was held 3 days later at the Nashville Veterans Cemetery, a simple ceremony attended by a handful of former military colleagues in the Parker family. Catherine had arranged for a veterinary technician to stay with Duke at the clinic, unwilling to risk his recovery by moving him too soon. Max and Lady stood with perfect military bearing on either side of Emma throughout the service, their presence drawing curious glances from the cemetery staff. Captain Daniel Morrison, Robert's former commanding officer, approached the family afterward. "I served with Robert for 15 years, he said, his weathered face solemn beneath silver hair. Those dogs meant everything to him. When his military career ended due to injury, training service animals became his purpose." He knelt to stroke Max's head, the shepherd permitting the touch with dignified acceptance. He would be pleased to know they found a good home. James nodded, still processing the responsibility they had undertaken. "We're learning as we go, they're extraordinary animals." "More than you know," Morrison replied cryptically. Robert's work with the 75th was classified at the time. "These aren't ordinary service dogs." He handed James a business card. "Call me if you have questions about their training or capabilities. Or if you need anything at all." As they were preparing to leave, a black luxury sedan pulled into the cemetery entrance. Thomas Crawford emerged from the back seat, accompanied by a sharp-featured man carrying a leather briefcase. "I thought he was in custody," Catherine murmured to James, instinctively moving closer to Emma and the dogs. "Released on bail this morning," Officer Reynolds answered, having overheard as he approached their group. "I came to pay my respects to Robert and to warn you Crawford has retained Martin Blackwell, the most aggressive estate attorney in Nashville." The officer's warning proved prescient. Blackwell approached with confident strides, Crawford trailing behind with an expression of practiced grief that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," Blackwell began without preamble. "I represent Mr. Thomas Crawford, nephew and legal heir to the estate of Robert Wells." He produced a document from his briefcase. "I'm serving you with formal notice to return the 3 German shepherds currently in your possession to my client within 48 hours. James accepted the document with a steady hand. "Robert Wells signed legal transfer of ownership to us before his death. We have the documentation." Blackwell smiled thinly. "Documentation signed while Mr. Wells was under hospice care, heavily medicated, and not of sound mind. We'll be challenging the validity of those documents." His gaze shifted to Max and Lady. "In the meantime, my client is prepared to offer a generous settlement for the prompt return of the animals." "They're not for sale," Catherine stated firmly. "Everything has a price," Mrs. Parker, Crawford interjected, his attention fixed on the dogs. "Especially exceptionally trained military assets like these. 20,000 each cash. Think what that could do for your daughter's future." Emma's small fingers tightened in Lady's fur. "They're not things," she said, her young voice surprisingly steady. "They're family." Crawford's expression hardened. "They're property, little girl, valuable property that your parents can't afford to keep." "That's enough." Captain Morrison stepped forward, his military bearing unmistakable. "These animals were released from military service to Robert Wells personally in recognition of his distinguished career. They were never intended to be sold or exploited." "Sentimentality doesn't change legal ownership," Captain Blackwell replied smoothly. "My client is Robert's closest living relative. Without a valid will specifying otherwise, Tennessee law is clear about inheritance rights." Officer Reynolds cleared his throat. "Perhaps this discussion should continue elsewhere. This is neither the time nor place." Blackwell nodded with feigned deference. "Of course. We'll continue this conversation in court." To James he added, "Judge Pearson is reviewing our emergency petition this afternoon. Expect formal notice by morning." As Crawford and his attorney departed, Morrison turned to the Parkers with grave concern. "Judge Pearson is notoriously conservative on property rights. and Crawford isn't entirely wrong about Tennessee inheritance law. Catherine felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Just when they had begun to envision a future with the three shepherds, this new threat emerged. "What can we do?" "Fight," James said simply, watching the black sedan disappear down the cemetery lane. "Robert entrusted them to us for a reason." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of legal consultations and mounting anxiety. The emergency petition was granted, setting a hearing for the following Monday, just 5 days away. Their attorney, a friend of Dr. Warner's who had agreed to represent them at a reduced rate, was blunt about their chances. The transfer documents are properly executed, but Crawford's argument about Robert's mental state could be persuasive. "We need more than paperwork. We need to demonstrate why Robert would have wanted you specifically to have the dogs." The connection to James's father seemed promising until they discovered that Captain John Parker's military records from his time with the 75th Rangers remained classified. Without access to those records, they couldn't prove any direct connection between Robert, the dogs, and James's family. Meanwhile, Duke's recovery had progressed enough for him to return home, though he required careful monitoring and medication every 6 hours. The shepherd's presence completed the trio, yet his weakened state only emphasized the Parker family's vulnerability. That if Crawford won custody, Duke's medical needs would likely be neglected in favor of maximizing profit. On Sunday evening, with the hearing looming the next morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the farm. Thomas Crawford's Mercedes rolled up the gravel driveway just as dusk was settling over the hills. James met him on the porch, his expression guarded. "You're not welcome here, Crawford." Crawford raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I came alone, no attorneys, no legal documents, just a conversation between reasonable men." Catherine joined her husband, arms crossed. "There's nothing to discuss. The dogs aren't for sale." "I understand your attachment," Crawford replied, his tone carefully modulated. "But you need to understand what you're dealing with." He glanced toward the barn where the shepherds were temporarily housed while Duke recovered. "Those aren't just service dogs. They were part of a specialized military program. Their training included target identification, explosive detection, and," he hesitated, "elimination protocols." James frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Project Cerberus," Crawford said quietly. "A classified military initiative developing canine assets for specialized operations." Robert wasn't just a handler, he was the program's chief training officer until a Taliban sniper ended his field career. He extracted a flash drive from his pocket. "This contains classified documents detailing the dog's capabilities. Documents that would concern any responsible parent." Catherine's throat tightened. "Are you threatening us?" "Warning you," Crawford corrected. "These animals were designed for warfare. They responded to coded commands that activate specific behaviors incompatible with family life." He held out the flash drive. "See for yourself. Then consider my offer again." James made no move to take it. "If these documents are classified, how did you obtain them?" Crawford smiled thinly. Robert wasn't the only one with military connections. "The point is, these dogs are potentially dangerous, especially to a child. The court needs to know this before allowing you to keep them." "Get off our property," James said, his voice low and dangerous. After Crawford departed, Catherine and James debated late into the night. The allegation was serious enough to warrant consideration, yet the timing and source made it suspect. "He's desperate," Catherine argued. "He knows the court might rule in our favor, so he's trying to frighten us into surrendering." "But what if there's some truth to it?" James countered. "We've both noticed their unusual intelligence, their responsiveness to specific phrases. What if they were part of some experimental program?" As they argued, neither noticed Emma standing in the hallway, her small face solemn in the dim light. She slipped out the back door and made her way to the barn, determined to protect her newfound family. The next morning, Catherine went to wake Emma for breakfast and found her bed empty. Panic surged through the household as they searched every room before racing to the barn. There they discovered Emma curled between Max and Duke, with Lady standing guard at the door. "Emma, what are you doing out here?" Catherine demanded, relief making her voice sharper than intended. "We're protecting them," Emma answered simply. "Mr. Crawford wants to hurt him. I heard you talking." James knelt beside his daughter. "Sweetheart, adults sometimes need to discuss difficult things. Mr. Crawford made some claims about the dogs that concerned us, but that doesn't mean we believe him." Emma's gaze was unwavering. "He's lying. They would never hurt me. They protect me like they protected Robert." She stroked Duke's head gently. "Lady says they were special helpers for soldiers, not weapons. They find lost people and keep them safe." Catherine and James exchanged glances, struck once again by Emma's unusual connection with the animals. As they prepared for the court hearing that would determine the dog's fate, neither could shake the feeling that their 6-year-old daughter understood something fundamental that they had yet to grasp. The Davidson County Courthouse stood imposing against the morning sky as the Parkers arrived for the custody hearing. Their attorney, Ellen Matthews, met them at the entrance, her expression cautiously optimistic. "Judge Pearson has agreed to hear testimony from Captain Morrison," she informed them. "That's unusual in a property dispute, which suggests he's not viewing this as a simple inheritance case." Catherine nodded, adjusting Duke's special harness. The shepherd's surgical incision was healing well, but he still moved gingerly. All 3 dogs wore their official service vests, the military insignia drawing respectful glances from courthouse security. "What about Crawford's allegations?" James asked quietly, ensuring Emma couldn't overhear. "The classified program he mentioned." Ellen shook her head. "Without documentation, it's just hearsay. He'd need military confirmation to introduce those claims, and if the program was truly classified, that's unlikely." The courtroom was surprisingly full when they entered. Word had spread through the community, and many faces from the veterinary clinic in their small town occupied the gallery. Thomas Crawford sat at the plaintiff's table, his attorney organizing documents with practiced efficiency. Judge Pearson, a stern-faced man in his 60s, called the court to order. "This is an unusual case," he began. "Typically, inherited property disputes follow clear statutory guidelines. However, the nature of the property in question, 3 trained service animals, introduces additional considerations." Blackwell opened with a straightforward argument. As Robert's closest living relative, Crawford was entitled to inherit all property not specifically bequeathed to others. The transfer documents, he contended, were signed when Robert was heavily medicated and of questionable mental capacity. Ellen countered by presenting the hospice physician's affidavit, confirming Robert's mental clarity on the day the documents were signed. She then called Captain Morrison to testify about Robert's long-standing intentions for the dogs. Robert was explicit that these animals were never to be sold or separated, Morrison stated firmly. He selected the Parker family specifically after observing their interaction with the dogs. And how would he have observed a family he'd never met? Blackwell challenged. Morrison hesitated, glancing at the Parkers. "I'm not at liberty to discuss certain aspects of the dog's training or capabilities, but—" Judge Pearson leaned forward. "Captain, this court has authorized limited disclosure of relevant classified information for this proceeding." Morrison nodded. "Your Honor, the dogs were part of a specialized reconnaissance unit. They were trained to observe and report information about specific targets, originally enemy combatants, later adapted for search and rescue operations. Robert maintained remote monitoring of the dog's vital signs and location at all times, even after his retirement." Catherine felt a chill run through her. "He was watching us through the dogs?" "Not exactly," Morrison clarified. "He received data on their physiological responses to you: heart rate, stress levels, bonding indicators. These dogs were specially selected for their ability to assess human intentions and emotional states. In essence, Robert trusted their judgment about suitable guardians more than his own." Crawford leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney, who immediately stood. Your Honor, this testimony supports our contention that these animals are specialized military assets, not ordinary pets. Their value and capabilities make them inappropriate for a family setting. Ellen had anticipated this argument. That brings us to our next witness, Your Honor. She turned toward the courtroom doors. The defense calls Michael Thompson, Veterans Affairs social worker. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit entered, carrying a manila folder. After being sworn in, Thompson explained his role in Robert's care during his final months. Mr. Wells was concerned about his dog's future, Thompson testified. When he learned his prognosis was terminal, he established specific criteria for their placement. They were to stay together, live in a rural setting, and most importantly find a family with a child who needed them as much as they needed a family. Ellen approached the witness. Did Mr. Wells ever mention his neighbor Thomas Crawford as a potential guardian for the dogs? Thompson's expression hardened. Mr. Wells explicitly excluded Mr. Crawford from consideration. He documented concerns about Crawford's financial interest in the dog's training and his lack of emotional connection to the animals. Objection. Blackwell rose. Hearsay from a deceased party. Your Honor, Ellen countered. Mr. Thompson's notes were made contemporaneously as part of his professional duties. They qualify as business records, exception to hearsay. Judge Pearson nodded. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Thompson. Thompson opened his folder. 2 weeks before Mr. Wells entered hospice care, he reported that Mr. Crawford had approached military contacts seeking information about Project Guardian, the civilian adaptation of the program these dogs participated in. Mr. Wells believed Crawford intended to sell the dogs to a private security firm. Crawford's face flushed with anger. That's a lie. I was helping Robert. Mr. Crawford, control yourself, Judge Pearson warned. To Thompson he said, does your file indicate why Mr. Wells didn't simply state these concerns in his will? He believed his original will had been compromised, Thompson replied. That's why he arranged for the note in the waterproof container and the careful legal transfer once the dogs found a suitable family. Ellen approached the bench. Your Honor, we have one final witness whose testimony is crucial to understanding why Robert Wells selected the Parker family specifically. She turned toward the gallery. The defense calls William Johnson, Veterans Affairs Records Specialist. Johnson, a thin man with round glasses, carried a sealed envelope bearing military insignias. After being sworn in, he presented the envelope to the judge. This was declassified this morning through an emergency protocol, Johnson explained. It contains service records for Captain John Parker, 75th Ranger Regiment, who served alongside Lieutenant Robert Wells during Operation Mountain Shadow in 1974. Gaines inhaled sharply. His father had rarely spoken about his military service, especially his time with the Rangers. Johnson continued, according to these records, Lieutenant Wells was severely wounded during an ambush. Captain Parker carried him 3 miles to extraction under enemy fire, saving his life. They remained close until Captain Parker's death 15 years ago. The courtroom fell silent as the implications settled. Judge Pearson reviewed the documents carefully before addressing the Parkers directly. It appears Robert Wells recognized the Parker name when the dogs identified your vehicle. He monitored their interaction with your family through their specialized training and determined you were the appropriate guardians. Is that your understanding? Catherine nodded, stunned by the revelations. We had no idea there was any connection to James's father. We just knew the dogs seemed drawn to us, especially to Emma. Thompson cleared his throat. There's one more thing, Your Honor. Mr. Wells left a sealed letter to be delivered only if his wishes regarding the dogs were challenged. Judge Pearson accepted the envelope, reading its contents silently before looking up with a changed expression. Mr. Crawford, were you aware that Robert Wells was recording your conversations during the last months of his life? Crawford's face drained of color. That's not legal. Tennessee is a one-party consent state, Ellen interjected. If Mr. Wells was a party to the conversation, his recording was perfectly legal. Judge Pearson nodded. Mr. Wells has provided transcripts of conversations where you explicitly discuss selling the dogs to a private military contractor for $75,000 each, as well as your plans to contest any attempts to place them elsewhere. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Crawford conferred frantically with his attorney. Emma leaned against Catherine, whispering, "Lady knew. She said Robert was watching over them even when he wasn't there." Judge Pearson called for order. Based on the evidence presented, I find the transfer of ownership documents to be valid and binding. The 3 German shepherds known as Max, Duke, and Lady are legally the property of James and Catherine Parker. He paused, his stern gaze fixing on Crawford. Furthermore, I am referring the transcript evidence to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential fraud charges against Mr. Crawford. As the judge's gavel fell, a collective sigh of relief passed through the Parker family. The dogs, who had maintained perfect composure throughout the proceedings, finally relaxed their posture, with Duke gently leaning against James's leg in apparent exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, Captain Morrison approached with an extended hand. Congratulations. Robert would be pleased." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. The specialized program these dogs participated in wasn't weapons-based as Crawford implied. It was focused on therapeutic applications for veterans with PTSD, dogs who could anticipate anxiety attacks and provide emotional support during episodes." Catherine looked at Emma, who was kneeling beside Lady, their foreheads touching in silent communion. That explains their connection with Emma. They recognized her grief. Orison nodded. They were trained to find the person in a group experiencing the most emotional distress. Your daughter's recent loss would have registered immediately. He smiled faintly. Robert believed these dogs could heal broken hearts. Looks like he was right. A gentle spring rain tapped against the farmhouse windows as Catherine sat at the kitchen table reviewing the final documentation from their attorney. 1 year had passed since the court hearing that had officially made Max, Duke, and Lady permanent members of the Parker family. The thick folder before her contained the last pieces of Robert Wells' legacy trust documents, ensuring the dogs' care for their lifetime and establishing a foundation in his name. The Robert Wells Veteran Service Animal Foundation is officially operational, Catherine announced as James entered with an armload of groceries. The paperwork came through this morning. James smiled, setting the bags on the counter. Robert would be proud. How many applications have we received so far? 17, Catherine replied, gesturing to her laptop. Veterans from across Tennessee seeking service animals or assistance with costs for existing ones. The VA has already referred 5 more for next month. The foundation had been James's idea, born during Duke's lengthy recovery. The $15,000 Robert had left them had covered Duke's medical expenses, with enough remaining to establish a small fund for similar cases. When news of their court battle spread through the veteran community, donations began arriving from across the country. What had started as a modest memorial to Robert had blossomed into a full-fledged nonprofit with Catherine as its executive director, allowing her to reduce her clinic hours and work primarily from home. "Where's Emma?" James asked, putting away the groceries with the efficient movements of a man who had found his rhythm in domestic life. "We're in the north pasture with the dogs. They're working with the new trainee." Catherine's voice carried a note of pride she no longer attempted to hide. The transformation in their lives had been comprehensive. James had finally sold the unproductive back 40 acres of the farm to a neighboring organic farmer, and using the proceeds to renovate the barn into a proper training facility for service dogs. The construction company he'd worked for had increasingly assigned him to projects building accessible housing for veterans, recognizing his newfound passion and expertise. Catherine's metamorphosis had been perhaps the most remarkable. The woman who once crossed the street to avoid pet owners walking their dogs now conducted weekly training sessions for veterans and their service animals. Her xenophobia had receded gradually through daily exposure and the unwavering patience of 3 extraordinary shepherds, who seemed to understand her boundaries intuitively. "Is Dr. Warner joining us for dinner?" James asked, referring to the veterinarian who had become both a close friend and the Foundation's medical director. Catherine nodded. "And she's bringing the coordinator from the Nashville VA. They want to discuss expanding the program to include placement of service animals in schools for children with trauma histories." Outside, Emma's laughter carried through the open kitchen window, a sound that had once been so rare they had nearly forgotten its melody. At 7, she had blossomed into a confident child with an uncanny ability to communicate with animals of all kinds. The local school had recognized her gift, allowing the dogs to accompany her on alternate days as part of a pilot program studying the impact of service animals on childhood grief and trauma recovery. The 3 German Shepherds had settled into clear roles within their family structure. Max, now 9, remained the vigilant protector, sleeping outside Emma's room and accompanying Catherine on her Foundation business. Duke, fully recovered from his surgery, had become James's shadow, his gentle intelligence making him an ideal demonstration dog for training sessions. Lady, the youngest at 7, was unquestionably Emma's dog, their bond so intuitive that they often seemed to communicate without visible signals. "We should invite Captain Morrison for the Foundation launch next month," James suggested, joining Catherine at the table. "Without his testimony, we might have lost them." Catherine agreed, adding his name to the guest list on her laptop. The military officer had become a regular visitor to the farm, bringing occasional updates about the program that had trained the Shepherds and connecting the Foundation with veterans who might benefit from their services. The investigation into Thomas Crawford had resulted in multiple fraud charges, though the most serious consequences had come from his military contacts after learning he had attempted to profit from a classified program. He had eventually left the state, his reputation in the community irreparably damaged. The sound of tires on gravel announced Dr. Warner's arrival. Through the kitchen window, Catherine watched Emma race toward the driveway, the 3 Shepherds moving in perfect formation around her, Max in front, Duke and Lady flanking her sides. The sight no longer triggered anxiety but instead filled Catherine with profound gratitude for the extraordinary circumstances that had brought these animals into their lives. "They still amaze me," James said quietly, following her gaze. "How they found us, how they knew Emma needed them." Catherine smiled, remembering the terrifying moment in the supermarket parking lot that had changed everything. "They chose us," she said simply. Dr. Warner entered carrying a cake box, her face alight with excitement. "Congratulations on the Foundation approval. This calls for celebration." As they prepared for dinner, Catherine reached for the framed photograph that now held a place of honor on their mantel. Robert Wells in his dress uniform, standing proudly with 3 young German Shepherd puppies. Beside it stood a newer image, Emma between her parents, surrounded by the same 3 dogs, but now distinguished by the gray around their muzzles but still radiating dignity and purpose. "I wish he could see this," Catherine murmured, touching the frame gently. "I think he can," Emma said, appearing suddenly at her side with the preternatural quietness she developed in her time with the dogs. "Lady says he watches sometimes." Catherine had long since stopped questioning Emma's unusual statements about what the dogs told her, whether it was the extraordinary empathic connection they'd been trained to establish or something more mystical. The results spoke for themselves. Emma was healing, the dogs were thriving, and their family had found its center. Dinner that evening extended late into the night as they finalized plans for the Foundation's official launch. The VA coordinator brought promising news about a federal grant program that might match their fundraising efforts, potentially doubling their impact in the coming year. "We've already identified 6 veterans whose PTSD symptoms might respond well to properly trained companions," he explained, reviewing the candidate profiles. "And 2 of them have children struggling with secondary trauma. The multi-generational impact could be significant." As the discussion continued, Catherine noticed Emma had fallen asleep on the living room sofa, surrounded by all 3 Shepherds in their customary positions. The scene captured something essential about their journey: a little girl who had been lost in grief, found and guarded by 3 extraordinary animals who had recognized her need and responded with unconditional devotion. Later that night, after their guests had departed and Emma was tucked into bed, Catherine and James stood on the porch watching fireflies rise from the spring grass. Duke rested at their feet, while Max maintained his nighttime post near Emma's window. Lady had taken her usual place on Emma's bed, the only dog permitted to sleep indoors, a concession Catherine had made gradually as her fear receded. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if they hadn't found us that day?" James asked, his arm around Catherine's shoulders. She considered the question carefully. "I think they would have kept searching until they found someone who needed them as much as we did." She leaned into his embrace. "But I'm grateful it was us." The farm that had once been a financial burden had found new purpose as a training center and occasional weekend retreat for veterans working with service animals. The family that had existed in fragile detachment had knitted itself together around 3 remarkable dogs who had refused to leave a little girl alone in a parked car. 3 stray German shepherds, James mused, echoing the phrase that had begun their journey. Except they were never really strays, were they? They were on a mission. Catherine smiled, remembering her initial terror at the sight of 3 large dogs surrounding her car with Emma inside. The memory now carried a different resonance, not fear but the first tentative step toward healing for all of them. "Mission accomplished," she said softly, but as the fireflies danced and Duke's gentle breathing kept time with the cricket song rising from the fields Robert Wells had never seen but had somehow known would be the perfect home for his beloved companions. In the distance, an owl called out across the Tennessee hills, and for a moment Catherine could almost believe it carried Robert's voice, blessing the family his dogs had chosen and the legacy they continued to build together, one transformed life at a time. Life's most profound connections often arrive unexpectedly, sometimes in forms we initially fear. The story of Emma and the 3 German shepherds reminds us that healing seldom follows our planned path. But like Robert Wells, many of us worry about what and who we'll leave behind. We wonder if our life's purpose extends beyond our final days. This remarkable journey shows us that our legacy lives on through the connections we forge, sometimes bridging generations we never meet. For those of us who have known loss, who have felt the weight of loneliness in a crowded room, remember that purpose often finds us when we least expect it. The wisdom we've gathered through our years prepares us to recognize these moments when they arrive, those divine appointments that transform our remaining chapters. Your accumulated experience isn't just a collection of memories, it's a beacon guiding those who need exactly what you've learned to give. Like those remarkable dogs, your intuitive wisdom can still recognize where you're most needed. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.